It's my really great pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle Fine, our keynote speaker. Dr. Fine is a distinguished professor of critical psychology, women's studies, and urban education at CUNY's Graduate Center, and was the keynoter at our very first Consortium conference. We've come full circle. In addition to her teaching, she is the chief investigator for the CUNY admissions pilot for Consortium graduates. Some of you know her as the evaluator of the State Education Department's program, My Brother's Keeper.
I'm honored to be with you, my Consortium chosen family. You come from a long and radical line of Consortium educators who have refused to surrender to privatization, standardization, technocratic policies, the banality of evil, dehumanization or criminalization of your students. You carry the dreams and moans of the city into a radical vision for education, and I know that even today, half of your mind is on how you're going to meet your students tomorrow to speak about Tyree Nichols and to deal with the screams, his screams for his mother. You know that will be in your classroom, in your heart, and in your students. So I want to introduce you to the chutzpah of your elders. Does everybody know chutzpah? If not, you're in the wrong room, sorry. I want you to know your lineage because it's powerful, it's deep. As you could hear in the videos beforehand and from Anne, as you could see on the wall of fame, Consortium educators dreamed big and acted strategically. I'm going to name names, and that is a huge mistake, but I want to give you a sense of the power of your educational ancestry.com. So again, for whoever's excluded, apologies now. I don't want an email later. So we all remember Luis Gordon Acosta and Francis Lucerna, who dared to create El Puente Academy for Peace and Justice in Williamsburg for the community, by the community, and for the future of Williamsburg. I was always envious of Luis and Francis because they knew where they belonged. They knew they belonged in Williamsburg, and they knew that school owed it to the community. You're going to hear a lineage that's a little white and a little Jewish, not in the George Santos sense of Jewish, but in the early Consortium, unfortunately, we have gotten lots more diverse, anti-racist, and committed to deep inclusions. And then there were people like Eric Nadelstern and Janet Lieberman and Cece who knew that new immigrants to our city deserved their own educational spaces, always rooted in student voice, in participation, in reimagining curriculum and assessment, and yes, always committed to accountability. They knew who they were accountable to. Debbie, working with Haven Henderson and many others, insisted that poor kids deserved what rich kids were getting. Debbie knew that early. She had seen private schools, she had seen wealthy schools, and they set up CPE to deliver for kids in that community what she saw in the wealthier communities. And then there's like the amazing Anne Herb, Lucy Matos, Jill Herman, who had vision and chutzpah to create this very complex, occupied territory. Tear down the metal detectors, build the Maxine Green Museum, insist that there be a school-based health clinic in the building, and resist the colonial wrath of President Jennifer Robb and Hunter College. It was an amazing moment. People like Alan Dichter, Carol Forrester, again, I'm going to screw it up, I am leaving out too many of you. Peter Steinberg, who held my heart at Brandeis High School when we were there. 35 years ago. Jill and Marion Mokulescu and Jill Herman, when we started the consortium in Philadelphia, I called you because you were the most amazing teachers I had met, and I said, come, please help us develop a kind of critical pedagogy in Philadelphia. And of course you came. That was the consortium diaspora. In the old days, we had loft talks. Somebody had a loft, I don't really remember who. I was in charge of bringing the wine, and it was Friday afternoons, and it was educators from across small schools, transfer schools, consortium schools, just talking about the aches, the moans, the desires, the contradictions, the sense of possibility that was present in these schools. Because even then you knew, like today, that teachers talking to teachers is a way to keep education just. The consortium schools were where we were doing culturally responsive education long before that language was developed, inquiry-based assessments, queer studies. The consortium schools understood that students were bringing gifts, questions, capacities, and desires, and you met the need. One of the amazing things about the consortium schools is that you are a model of going to scale without standardizing, right? So you share a set of principles around student voice, capacity, need, desire, even as each of your schools is locally crafted, built on the gifts, the resources, and the struggles of your local communities. And mostly you know to whom you are accountable, not only for academic achievement, although you do that beautifully, as I will develop in a moment, but for social, for civic, for lives during COVID, for psychological, for cultural, for health. In the 25 years that the consortium has been growing, I've been at CUNY developing the Public Science Project. And these are kind of sister projects. Public Science Project is a research collective dedicated to research for and with movements for justice, institutions that are struggling to do practices that meet the justice demands of the time. In both your work and our work, we understood that asking hard questions is the nutrient to sustainability. And what you ask of your students, you have actually asked of me. You've asked me to accompany you for 25 years. I've worked alongside women at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility who were bringing back college and prison. I've worked along many educators in this room, and each movement where we brought the skills of research has been launched by educators and students in middle school, high schools, prisons, communities, and all of these projects were designed to swing open the doors of educational, ethical, cultural, racial imagination with high standards, participatory praxis by educators, anti-racist commitments, and powerful scaffolding for students. And in every case, including the evaluations of the consortium, the evidence has pointed in the same direction of enormous educational desire and achievement unleashed, racial disparities narrowed, school and prison cultures transformed, families, educators, students, and communities nourished toward democracy. And in each case, these movements, despite compelling evidence, have confronted resistance by small but powerful, loud group of privatizers, bureaucrats, administrators, upstate legislators, corporate interests, those who think opportunity should be reserved only for the white or the wealthy or the right zip codes. And in the spirit of radical vision, the consortium celebrates a 25-year anniversary, and yes, the struggle continues. If there were no struggle, it would mean that you sold out. So mazel tov, this is not a cushy job. 25 years ago, I spoke on this stage, and then we marched. I think we marched to Pataki's office. I have a picture of me standing on a garbage can with a megaphone, and we protested at the governor's office just for the right to educate young people toward dignity, inquiry, nourishing their freedom dreams and their assessment systems. Those were the days when Commissioner Tom Sobel fell in love with the consortium schools. He called it top-down support for bottom-up innovation. And since then, the desire to be part of the consortium has only expanded. The impact is both national and transnational, and we now have an archive of evidence of the impact of the consortium on students, educators, and communities. I'm just going to say a bit about each of those. Today, within the consortium, there is an incredible diversity of schools in terms of geography, demography, and pedagogical practices. Consortium schools are in 4 boroughs, you're upstate, you share deep commitments to those most marginalized. Immigrant, transfer, unhoused, queer, students struggling, and the rest of us. And you share commitments to transparency, equity, and accountability. I know that there is a deep desire throughout New York State for other schools to join the consortium, while New York remains one of only 8 states that still has high-stakes graduation requirements. Let me tell you something about the import of the consortium within the US, but transnationally. As the nation and the world ponders, are there alternatives to high-stakes testing that will be transparent, accountable, and equitable? They turn to you. Last summer, Anne was invited to a UNESCO meeting in Barcelona, where, by the way, she is a rock star. She did a 10 o'clock late-night TV show on performance assessment. You are all asked to consult to Colorado, California, New Jersey. Jamal Bowman asks you for help as he re-envisions legislation. The NEA and the AFT and Linda Darling Hammond turn to the consortium for models of what could be assessment that was in fact accountable. The evidence. Over 30 years, you have had the courage to inquire about your own impact. It's amazing. Schools tend to be defensive, kind of paranoid structures, not so interested in inquiry because the world is beating up on you, but not so with the consortium. You have asked yourselves to undertake inquiry. You have asked me to accompany you. And a range of studies have been undertaken. We now know that compared to New York City schools, consortium schools have higher rates of BIPOC students, English language learners, students who start out with low standardized test scores but don't end up that way, and higher rates of students with disability. And consortium schools have higher graduation rates, very low teacher turnover. How many of you, just raise your hand, if you went to a consortium school and now you're teaching in one? Who does that? Who goes back to their high school? You have lower school discipline problems, very high parental satisfaction, extremely high college-going rates, and diminished racial and ethnic disparities on all of those indicators. Yes, in Manhattan, and yes, in the Bronx. My students and I have been stalking you for 30 years, documenting your gorgeous practices and their consequences. Your refusal to engage in what Hannah Arendt would call the banality of evil, the thoughtless compliance with bureaucratic policies. Couple of examples. 20 years ago, Janice Bloom and Laurie Charget, two brilliant visionary consortium educators who have launched CARA, who also, by the way, have really good taste in men, Adam and Ben. They studied for their dissertation the delicate hinge between attending a consortium high school and going to college. Janice documented the enormous race-class disparities in college access, and Laurie followed consortium graduates into college, and she learned 4 things. I am simplifying. One is that consortium graduates are not scared of writing essays when they get to college. The second is that they were devastated at how crappy college higher ed teaching was compared to what all of you do. The third is that consortium graduates are committed to revision, a lost skill. They know how to take feedback and revise. They're not devastated by doing another draft. And the fourth is that when they hit a bump in the road, they find an adult to guide them through. They learn to trust educators both in college and, as you know, they come back to your high schools for help. Those are gifts of democracy, of resilience, of civic imagination. Most recently, my graduate student, Corinna Primoka, and I, working with Linda Darling-Hammond, set up a statistical database to track consortium students through CUNY. I think we'll get into this more in the question and answer. The short story is consortium students are more likely to be from the Bronx than most of CUNY, are more likely to be African American, Latino, and low income than most of CUNY, are more likely to persist, have higher GPA, higher credit accumulation, higher graduation rates than demographic peers at CUNY. And the kicker is this is true for students with SAT scores under 500 because my institution jacked up the requirements for entrance in 2008 to a 500 SAT score. Shame on us. We created a pilot. These are kids coming in below 500 and they're still outperforming their demographic peers at CUNY because you set them up to do that. And the second kicker is that the impact is most dramatic for young men of color, the impact of consortium education. So when people say, if we don't test, how will we know? The consortium has receipts. A word on radical intimacies within schools, and then I will end. You are consortium educators who refuse to surrender or give up on your students. I won't ask you to raise your hand if you've ever given money to a student who needed it, gave up your lunch, if you drove someone for a medical appointment, advised them on reproductive justice, allowed a student to sleep on your couch, paid for college application fees, helped them find a lawyer, a therapist, a foster home. What have I left out? During COVID, consortium schools didn't retreat. You kept a light on. You engaged on Zoom. You checked in. You invited students to write beautiful poetry and essays for the COVID-19 journal. So as public school educators, you are picking up the pieces of capitalism, white supremacy, housing crisis, organized state violence, police brutality, massive mental health crisis, trans and xenophobia, anti-Black, Asian, trans, Jewish, Muslim violence, a nation metastasized by inequities, the attack on all things public. You didn't create the global rise in authoritarianism or wealth gaps, the proliferation of guns or state violence, the assault on democracy, the demands of censorship, the brutality of police violence. You didn't create COVID or gentrification, the assault on reproductive or queer justice, but we can't simply bend or ignore. I love that I've been invited here to accompany you today for a spa of educational wisdom. Consortium educators, you are part of a long freedom struggle. The consortium, like CUNY, is a love story. It's a struggle for educational justice, not yet, where we link arms to build schools that must be. Like all love stories, we have crushes on Debbie and Ann and Herb and so many others. Like all love stories, there are betrayals, which is why we marched then, and undoubtedly we will march again. Like all love stories, there's a luscious commitment to a good enough life, not just for those of us with shrinking pensions, but for our students, the ones who made you cry with joy and the ones who got away. I honor you, Consortium family. Thank you.